Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very grateful to be here. I am the author of Total Flabbiness. These words were uttered by Michel Houellebecq in an interview with the German magazine Der Spiegel last year. Some of the meaning might disappear in the English translation of the word avachissement. I spoke to Marjorie this morning about that the word avachissement comes from the French word for cow, vache. So I think it's even worse in French. But I still think it's a good place to start when speaking of about the subject of aging in Houellebecq's novels. This statement is not only symptomatic of the way aging is represented in his novels, where avachissement or flabbiness is the main trait associated with aging, but also of his literary project as a whole, where human and cultural decline is a recurrent theme. The statement is also characteristic of the way in which Houellebecq presents himself in public, something that can lead us to believe that he wishes to be considered as the incarnation of human resignation and decline. Avachissement, as well as flabbiness, can be described as a lack of strength, force, and determination, and covers thus both the physical and moral or emotional aspect of aging as decline. In Houellebecq's novels, physical decline is often related to women, while moral decline is usually related to men. While the aging man is often characterized by a lack of will and energy, the aging woman is typically described as suffering from a loss of beauty or physical attraction. However, these two aspects cannot be distinguished as simply as that. The male characters in the novels of Houellebecq suffer above all from a lack of virility. Virility can be regarded as the complete opposite of flabbiness, and signifies a set of qualities culturally assigned to men, such as masculine energy, courage, strength, forcefulness, as well as sexual potency. In contemporary Western culture, as represented by Houellebecq, virility has once again become an important quality. And this ideal doesn't give Houellebecq's male characters an advantage. They all fail to adapt to a traditionally masculine image of man, but also to a more modern ideal. Instead, they suffer from a lack of virility and can be regarded as victims of a crisis of virility that can be said to have been developing since the middle of the 20th century. According to certain anthropologists, such as Jean-Jacques Courtin, it was then that masculinity entered a zone of cultural turbulence. So when these male characters do not feel virile, they feel instead flabby, and consequently they feel old. As a novelist, Houellebecq has become one of the most famous and also one of the most controversial contemporary authors in France as well as all over Europe. Between 1994 and 2015, he has published 6 novels, and at the core of all of his writings is human suffering and the malice of the modern world. This view of life is strongly inspired by Schopenhauer, who understands life as an alternation between suffering and boredom. Less evident is perhaps that the suffering in Houellebecq's novels is usually related to the sensation of getting older. So even though the subject of aging might not be the most striking when reading his novels, Houellebecq pays a particular interest to the subjective experience of aging and the suffering this contains in all of his works. In his novels, the struggle against aging, an idealization of youth, and the dream of immortality constitute recurrent themes, as do resignation and the wish to die in order to be freed from the suffering. However, I find 3 novels particularly interesting in this context: The Elementary Particles, the Possibility of an Island, and The Map and the Territory. Through these three novels, it is possible to trace a thematic development from a desire of eternal youth to a dream of immortality to a wish for death. The Elementary Particles is above all a critique of the youth culture which dominates our age. In this novel, Houellebecq reveals the consequences of the generation of '68 and the sexual revolution, especially how this generation, ironically, has produced domination structures in our society based on physical and sexual attraction. The main characters in the novel are the two half-brothers Bruno and Michel, who both illustrate in different ways the consequences of the sexual liberation. They were both abandoned by their parents because, I quote, "the burden of caring for a small child was incompatible with their ideal of personal freedom." They both suffer from their parents' selfishness and struggles when it comes to becoming and staying attached to someone else. Through his adolescence, Bruno is dictated by his sexual desire, a desire which is never satisfied because he is at the lowest level of the social and sexual hierarchy. Michel, on the other hand, seems to lack a sexual instinct. He is absent-minded and apathetic, and he impersonates, from a very young age, total resignation. Michel is a scientist who studies the biological evolution of mankind, and the most radical of his proposals is that mankind must disappear and give way to a new species, I quote, "asexual and immortal, a species which had outgrown individuality, separation, and evolution." The prologue and epilogue of the novel indicate that this has already happened and that the narrative we are reading is set in the past. This idea of a fundamental transformation of humanity is even more explicitly formulated in The Possibility of an Island, Houellebecq's fourth novel. As in The Elementary Particles, the narrative circles around our society's youth and body obsession, but in this novel, the resistance against aging goes even further. In this narrative, the human suffering related to aging and the dream of immortality, or the dream of eternal youth, lead to the actual replacement of mankind with cloned neo-humans. In Houellebecq's fifth novel, The Map and the Territory, the subject of aging is particularly represented through the father of the main character, Jed, who lives in a retirement home but decides to go to Switzerland to end his life in a euthanasia clinic. Houellebecq reveals how this clinic, which ironically is called Dignitas, is a business that benefits from human resignation. The curse of aging is still as present in this novel as in the other ones, but instead of fighting against the course of nature, the characters respond to aging with resignation and melancholy. They wish to suffer as little as possible, and the solution can be either isolation or suicide. So, in The Elementary Particles, the first of these novels, Houellebecq presents in a quite explicit way the socio-cultural context that forms the backdrop of the other novels, and in order to analyze the representation of aging and how this functions as a means of social criticism, it is essential to take this novel into consideration. So for this reason, I will focus on this novel from now on. I think I've already made quite clear that a prominent idea in all of Houellebecq's novels is that in our era, the young people are triumphing and the happy period of life is youth. Nevertheless, it is possible to feel old in youth, which is maybe the main source of suffering in these novels. The characters are seldom actually old, but rather young or middle-aged people who feel already old. This is the case for the two brothers in The Elementary Particles. It was in the late 1970s, Michel and Bruno were in their 20s and already felt old. As time went on, they would feel older still and be ashamed by the fact. Their generation was about to make a dramatic shift, substituting the tragedy of death with the more general humiliation of old age. As we can see from this passage, the reason why the young people feel old has to do with the civilization they live in the contemporary society portrayed by Houellebecq. Traditional and moral values related to community, family, and love have disappeared. They've been replaced by more superficial values, such as beauty, strength, and virility, which almost without exception are synonymous with youth or youthfulness. In this world, where consummation and pleasure constitute the principal center of interest, the young, fit, and slim body is the only attractive one, and aging is above all understood as physical decline, in particular loss of sexual attraction. As I've already mentioned, Houellebecq reveals how this body-obsessed society is the ironic result of the sexual liberation. The generation of 68, those who fought for sexual freedom, are now the victims of the cult of the body created by themselves. I quote, "As member of a generation who, more than any before, had proclaimed the superiority of youth over age, they could hardly claim to be surprised when they, in turn, were despised by succeeding generations. As their flesh began to age, the cult of the body, which they had done so much to promote, simply filled them with an intensifying disgust for their own bodies, a disgust they could see mirrored in the gaze of others." Houellebecq reveals how this fight for personal freedom has generated the individualism that dominates our time, where the individual is like an atomic element, liberated from structural networks such as family, community, and tradition. This conception of our culture is very similar to what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls the liquid modernity or liquid society. This notion refers to our postmodern society, where pleasure, consummation, and individual freedom are the most important values. As we also can read from the previous passage, in this society the fear of death is replaced by the fear of living in a decayed body. As we've seen, this is the result of the body obsession, but it's also related to a changed conception of death in our time. I quote, "Contemporary consciousness is no longer equipped to deal with our mortality. Never in any other time or any other civilization have people thought so much or so constantly about aging. Each individual has a simple view of the future. A time will come when the sum of pleasures that life has left to offer is outweighed by the sum of pain. This weighing up of pleasure and pain, which everyone is forced to make sooner or later, leads logically, at a certain age, to suicide. In part, this is because they are somewhat tired of life, but the principal reason is that nothing, not even death, seems worse than the prospect of living in a broken body." In this universe, the lifetime is not at all represented as a cycle or as a coherent narrative, but rather as a line declining inevitably downwards. The human life is no longer understood as a continuous and meaningful process. This conception of life must be regarded as a result of the loss of religion which marks our culture, according to Houellebecq. Christian doctrine, which long had been the dominant moral force in Western civilization, accorded unconditional importance to every human life from conception to death. The significance was linked to the belief in the existence within the body of a soul, which was by definition immortal and would ultimately return to God. In the 19th and 20th centuries, advances in biology gave rise to a more materialist anthropology, radically different in its assumptions and significantly more moderate in its ethical counsel. The loss of religion signifies a loss of transcendence and the meaning of life and the possibility to transgress the individual and the waiting for death. The replacement of religion with what Houellebecq calls the materialist anthropology is therefore crucial for the understanding of aging as decline. So I think it's quite obvious that for Houellebecq it seems unrealistic to live a good life in older age. As I hope I've been able to illustrate, his representations of aging as decline is integrated in a more general diagnosis of the contemporary world. In his novels, Houellebecq reveals how the dominance of capitalism, rationalism, hedonism, and last but not least, individualism in our time has changed our conception of aging and death. The image of the ruined body can be read as a metaphor of a ruined world, and the aging man can be understood as a symptom of an aging civilization nearing collapse. The human decline can thus be read as an image of a cultural decline in these novels. The representation of aging as decline therefore allows us to better understand Houellebecq's literary project and cultural pessimism as a whole. However, in contrast to typical theories of decadence and decline, where the idea of memento mori, or remember you must die, is central, even death has lost its tragic potential in these novels. As we've seen, the tragedy of death has here been substituted with the humiliation of old age. In The Map and the Territory, Houellebecq himself actually appears as a character who is brutally murdered. This strange or indifferent attitude towards death creates a surprising effect, something that is in fact characteristic for Houellebecq's writing style. The way in which he describes tragic events like death is usually cynical and indifferent, but the effect caused by this on the reader is the opposite of indifference. The reader is, if not moved in a positive way, at least shocked or repelled. This paradox is related to an ambiguity within his writing style. This ambiguity is often expressed through an irony that both undermines a literal meaning and that can be seen as a symptom or characteristic of the postmodern world as represented by Houellebecq. So, if I through this presentation have given or supported the impression of Houellebecq as a reactionary writer, I want to end by saying that it's not as simple as that. Thank you.